if these things are happening so much and rampant, and it is on the increasing, on the high rise on the African continent, and the majority of the African leaders have also been fingered out for corruption allegations. State CEOs have been fingered out for corruption allegations. Those monies that these people have allegedly stolen and, mismanaged, or however it is, these funds are coming from somewhere, and it is our own people who have squandered the money or misused the money, so to speak. Is China truly trapping African countries or trapping Africa with loans? This concept or this idea has been widely circulated. Let's find out the fact. Are they truly doing that, or it's just the myth of people talking to this regard? My name is Ishmael Mubarak, and this is MI4 Studios. Do follow us on Facebook as well as TikTok at MI4 Studios, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, MI4 Studios. Let's get interactive into the subject. The idea of Chinese debt trap in Africa has been widely circulated, but the growing body of research or persons and institutions of repute that do speak on behalf of quality relationship and non-suppression, repression, and depression or oppression of other sovereign nations have done research into this matter, and expert analysis is suggesting that the narrative is overrated and often misleading. Right? Is the narrative truly overrated? Is the narrative truly misleading? Is the research truly capturing what is happening between the Chinese, the People's Republic of China, and that of the African continent or the African state or countries that have reached out for loans and or from China? What is the debt trap narrative? China deliberately lends excessive amounts of money to African countries. When a country struggles to repay the money, China sees the strategic assets like ports and railways, and this is seen as a form of a debt trap diplomacy, to gain geopolitical leverage. This is the entire claim that China is being heckled with, or this is the entire claim that we are facing, or the myth we are trying to break down as it stands right now. Yes. Has evidence shown beyond all reasonable doubt that China is deliberately entrapping African countries with debt or loans? China is not Africa's largest creditor. If I have to bust your bubble, but I'll come into the subject. Why is it important to know whether China is the biggest African creditor or not? If it is the biggest African creditor, then we could say that handedly, or out of any formal or official research, there is a rampant seizure of assets, then we could say that China truly is doing what it is doing. But then there are certain countries that are doling more cash onto or into the African continent or the African economy more than the Chinese. As of 2022, Chinese loans made up only 6% of Africa's total external debt, while the private lenders and multinationals or multinational institutions accounted for the much that we cannot talk about. And so therefore, if China is seizing one or two assets for strategic reasons to be able to repay its debt after loaning out the money or setting up the infrastructure or the developmental infrastructure for a country A or country B. The few that has come up, which is born out of the 6% of the total external debt of Africa, rating from 2022 up until today. Yes, the number has slightly increased, but China isn't still Africa's leading creditor, and is stipulated between 6 to 10% of the total external debt or loans to Africa. And so, why the widespread? The often cited example is of Sri Lanka's, Hambota, port. That is not directly why these criticisms or the mention of China to this regard. If you take a look at the widely speculated or stated example, which is the Sri Lanka's Hambantota, port, which is not directly applicable to Africa, and even that case is more skewed than it has been portrayed on the system. And so therefore, can anybody, aside the Sri Lanka seizure of port, confirm whether China has seized and is running to be able to get its money back any state infrastructure? Yes, there are cases where they have come together to run it. So, it's my money. We come to build for you a developmental infrastructure, railway, like airport, something else. You're unable to pay the money, and probably it's born out of mismanagement. Like, for example, Ghana's airport is somewhat of a contractual agreement with some people, and there is a running of the airport to be able to pay the monies back to the creditors. Right. And so therefore, there are circumstances you find a public-private partnership, a government-to-government partnership, or a bilateral agreement that is supporting how something is to be done. Right. The African Agency Matters or African government actively seek Chinese loans to fund infrastructure and development. Not because they are being coerced, but because the alternative is or are limited. The main reason why you would find majority of African states or countries reaching out to the Chinese government for Chinese loan for especially infrastructural development is because there is no other area you can get those loans from. And the reason is that African countries have failed to service their debt properly. They have failed to stick with conditionalities of certain creditors. And most of the African countries, according to their debt to GDP ratio, are not credit worthy. And even if they are credit worthy, the amount of money is minute and doesn't correspond or reciprocate to how much is required for certain structural development. And hence, that is why China has become the bane or the stop for countries of Africa to go seek for loan. And also, the loan terms vary. China loan often have a lower interest rate than private lenders, and China has shown flexibility in renegotiating terms such as extension of repayment period. And so these things have made China very attractive for African government and leaders who would either intentionally or unintentionally, not stick to payment terms or negotiations according to how they're going to use the money and according to how it's going to be accounted for, according to how the state institution or structures are going to be managed to be able to recoup these monies back and be able to pay China with their low, interest rate on the African continent. So when you take a look at it, most of the infrastructural development happening on the African continent is supported by the Chinese government or the People's Republic of China. And once that is happening, the notion is that, oh, since it happened elsewhere, it could happen here too because they are defaulting their loans. One simple question that I want to ask everybody is that, are we diligent enough as Africans, especially when it comes to financial management? Are we diligent enough? In fact, do we even deserve anybody giving us loans? And if we have to even talk about loans, is Africa, a continent as rich as it is, supposed to be looking for loans? What has happened? Failed leadership, and the same failed leadership would fail in terms of reciprocating the same diplomatic what you call it, relationship that has been given by certain other firms, and the narrative will be spread out there that Chinese government is doing ABCD just to be able to entrap the government. Well, the money was not for free. You have had the infrastructure and you must pay. Regardless where I am coming from as an African, I do not share in any sentiment where any African country has gone for a loan from China with the interest rate that you agreed to and with the terms and conditions that you agreed to, and whether you fulfilled the purpose of the loan or did not fulfill the purpose of the loan in your country, whether physically or not, if you have completed it or not, once the period of the loan has, reached for you to also return a favor back to where you got the money from, regardless of where I am coming from, no African country would I support not returning the monies. You have to return it because that is the case. And if you don't, and certain conditionalities of the loan agreement is being meted out to you, then it becomes a topic of disreputation for the people who have actually fed you or provided you with resources when you so needed it the most. And so what the Chinese loans are funding on the African continent, major infrastructure projects like railway, port and energy facilities, that is what Chinese loans are specifically going into. Why are they going into those products? They are going into those areas because such areas could be run and gain resources even when government in, government out are unable to stick to payment terms, and they could do something about getting their monies back. So these are often the productivity investment aimed at long-term economic growth and not just short-term consumption, and that is what China is interested in supporting. Right, let us take a look at the big picture. The African phase is a massive infrastructure $1 billion, annually something, because Africa needs so much in terms of infrastructural development, from roads to airports, to harbors, to factories, whatever, to road. It's so much, it's so many. And so therefore, Western lenders and institutions have scaled back infrastructure financing, leaving a vacuum that China has stepped into. Because when we get these monies and we use these monies in terms of infrastructural development, most of these infrastructural development are not completed, neither properly accounted for. And so therefore, these private lenders and Western lenders have realized that the African leader, after leaving power, is not responsible for how the loans are going to be handled and the repayment is going to be handled, as well as how the infrastructure project can be properly audited and accounted for to potentially pay back the money to China, which is something, it is so rampant on the African continent because we are so indisciplined in keeping up to our part of the negotiation, especially when it has to do with money. And that so many of our leaders have been accused of one or two corrupt practices, and it is so rampant there. So when these lenders realize that these countries are unable to stick to their end of the bargain, especially when it comes to infrastructure, they stepped out. They decided to invest in other things other than infrastructural development. And now the most popular or the right place to go for infrastructural, loans or facilities to your country, especially in Africa, is China, just because they have come to step into that. So the real issue is not China lending per se, but the lack of affordable long-term developmental finance globally. And that is what is also part of the issue that has been caused. And why this myth is persistent up to this time: geographical rivalry. When I say geographical rivalry, I'm saying Western powers often frame China or China's role in Africa, trying to make China very unpopular, because as it stands right now, China is able to hatch a very pretty beautiful relationship with Africa. And we all do know that about 40 to 50% of the world's natural resources, minerals, is coming from Africa in terms of diamond, gold, bauxite, manganese. You could talk about californium. You could talk about a dozen number of natural resources you could talk about, and it's coming from there. And so if China is leading in terms of socio bilateral relationships with African countries, it will be quite easier for these African countries to choose to do business with the People's Republic of China than the Western countries. And so therefore it needs to make it very unpopular for certain business reasons in this area. And you can also find out that the People's Republic of China is very common to come to the aid of African countries. Just recently, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, it has opened its borders to ensure that importers or exporters from Africa paid zero tariff or 0% tariff to the People's Republic of China. And these are some of the reasons why China is becoming too popular and so popular, for the good reasons on the African scene. And the Western powers, as a result of geographical rivalry, would want to put their reputation to disrepute in Africa. When you use such a niche to counter the relevance of the presence of a particular country in a particular country, at the end of the day, you are creating this particular needs, and the narrative has gone so far and people have consumed it to the extent that it is very, very difficult to undo this particular situation. Africans' debt, which is more than $1.12 trillion, is a total that was standing. And how much out of this total that goes to China is very, very low. To be honest with you, it's very low. If you go to, I wouldn't want to mention countries, yes, but then Chinese fraction out of this $1.12 trillion is 6 to 10% of it. So let's assume the highest ratio, it's even 10% of it. That is about just a fraction of the $1.12 trillion that is owed the Chinese to this regard. And so if it is a trap, the debt trap, which simply implies that international exploitation. But most of the debt distress arises from global economic shocks. Example, COVID, inflation, supply chain, and poor fiscal management and corruption in some government, fluctuating commodity prices. These are the areas where the debt distress comes from. And the major one is that of poor fiscal management and corruption in these countries. And you could be a witness. You could get a sheet of a very tall list of long-standing corruption allegations attached to almost every single infrastructure developmental project on the African continent in the last 10 years. And these monies were credit facilities that has been issued to the countries for such development. And so therefore, if almost every single developmental project, which is infrastructure led, in the wake of corruption allegation and stagnation of the progress of that particular infrastructure is ongoing, if these things are happening so much and rampant and it is on the increasing, on the high rise on the African continent. And the majority of the African leaders have also been fingered out for corruption allegations. State CEOs have been fingered out for corruption allegations. Those monies that these people have allegedly stolen and, mismanaged, or however it is, these funds are coming from somewhere, and it is our own people who have squandered the money or misused the money, so to speak. And so therefore, it has led to people trying to spew and spin the matter onto the source, and that is not a cool thing to do. And so China's role is significant as a leading lender, and I think that we should be appreciative more. And aside being appreciative more, we have to be able to have leaders who are extremely cautious before they sign on to any form of loan agreement, before they sign on to any form of relationship, before they go in for any form of facility. What is the interest rate? What is the recurrent rate? Is there a renegotiation? What happens if the loans enter into a certain level of distress? So have our leaders who have gone for these facilities done their homework? Did they sign the right contract? Did they actually foresaw? Were they visionary enough to look into time and to be able to avert some of these situations? Did they lead a proper implementation of what the loans have been for? China is continually a very sociable country to relate with. In terms of goods production, in terms of service production, yes, in terms of infrastructural development, and in terms of tourism and gadget technological advancement, you would realize that China is up there. Yes, they have had their issues in terms of illegal gold mining. You can talk about one or two issues, but when we put China here and put the entire world over here, you will realize the great impact of China onto the entire world, because China actually is providing about 40% or producing about 40% of everything that is being sold and consumed in the greatest country ever, the United States of America. If United States of America is consuming 40% China, how much more the rest of the world, and how much more Africa that actually needs so much in terms of developmental gap and has so much deficits in terms of infrastructural and technological advancement to this regard. Let us be decent, and we hope that our leaders will become a very decent leadership to this regard. There are positive aspects of the Chinese loan as infrastructure booming. They funded major projects like railways. Example is Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway and ports, as well as power plants across the African continent. They are helping bridging the financial gap as they've helped fill project after they've helped funded project faster than is supposed to be handled to this regard. So China is doing so much to this very regard. Job creation, when they come to make their investment and they loan up to countries for development and stuff, it creates jobs. And China's loans and support is having great technological investment in the country. Some projects have included training and skills development for local workers, and they have improved connectivity, enhanced regional trade and mobility through better transport. Energy access is one of the key things that the Chinese government has done for the African continent. So we can talk about all the goodies that they have done, from energy to technology to connectivity in terms of trade and bilateral relationship to creating of jobs and funding infrastructural project or developmental project faster than it's supposed to be, bridging the financial gap between Africa and the rest of the world, as well as booming in terms of infrastructure. China is a good effect. Africa's leadership and accountability, especially in the area of fiscal, management, is very questionable. My name is Ishmael Mubarak, and this is MI4 Studio. Subscribe to the channel. Follow us on Facebook and TikTok, MI4 Studios. Thank you for watching.